I was 13 years old the last time I went trick-or-treating. My friends and I had already discussed how this was probably our final year of roaming the neighborhood in costumes. We'd all agreed that once we hit high school, we didn't want to be caught in the act of trick-or-treating and risk the mockery that would surely follow. So we decided to go out with a bang, one last hurrah before we hung up our masks for good. That's when Liam thought up what I believed was a genius plan. A way for us to get sacks full of leftover candy from every house in the neighborhood. The logic was simple: all the younger kids would head out first, knocking on doors before it even got dark, and by 6 p.m. they'd be off the streets. After that, kids our age would take over, gathering up whatever was left. By 8:30 p.m., the streets would be mostly deserted. That was our time to strike. The perfect window where we'd swoop in and grab all the leftover candy that hadn't been claimed yet. We figured people would be tired, ready to call it a night, and more than happy to dump whatever they had left into our bags. No one would want the hassle of storing all that leftover candy, right? Unfortunately, our brilliant plan didn't work out as well as we thought. Most people weren't as generous as we'd hoped. Instead of candy, we got eye rolls and groans as we knocked on doors just when they thought they were done for the night. Some people didn't even bother answering. Despite that, we still managed to get a decent haul, with a few lucky scores along the way. But the night didn't end with us counting our spoils. It ended with us sprinting for our lives. We had just about finished our rounds when we spotted one last house. It was off the beaten path, a little isolated from the main neighborhood streets, and we realized we hadn't been to it yet. It was slightly hidden behind some overgrown bushes, and because it was set back from the street, it wasn't immediately visible. "Maybe no one's been there," I said, excited at the prospect of untouched candy. My friends Emily and Jason agreed. So we decided to give it a shot, figuring we'd either hit the jackpot or be disappointed one last time. As we walked up the pathway, the house seemed eerily quiet, but all the lights were still on. The front yard was littered with elaborate decorations that instantly set this house apart from all the others we'd seen. There were fake gravestones scattered across the lawn, cobwebs draped over the bushes, and a full skeleton hanging from a tree near the porch. It was a Halloween enthusiast's paradise, poor Jason muttered, eyes wide as he took in the scene. But what really caught our attention were the two huge bowls of candy sitting on the porch steps, with signs above them that read, "Take as much as you want, jackpot." "Liam, you were right," Emily whispered, excitement gleaming in her eyes. We eagerly approached the porch, but the closer we got, the more I started to notice something unsettling. Among all the decorations, there was a figure. A mannequin, I thought at first, leaning against the wall near the steps. It was dressed in a ragged costume, with its head slumped to the side and one arm dangling limply. A pool of what looked like fake blood surrounded it on the ground, but something about it didn't feel right. "Is that a prop?" I asked, my voice wavering. "Yeah, it's gotta be. Look at all the blood," Jason said, laughing nervously. "No one could bleed that much and live." Emily squinted at it, her face tense. "I don't know. It looks too real." Ignoring the uneasy feeling growing in my gut, I pushed forward. We were here for the candy, and we weren't leaving without it. But as soon as my foot hit the bottom step of the porch, the figure moved. At first, it was just a slight twitch, a barely noticeable shift in its position. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Then, in one horrifying motion, it raised its head and reached a trembling hand toward me. "Help me," it rasped, the voice weak and gurgling. Everything inside me screamed to run, but for a second I couldn't move. The figure's eyes, wild, desperate, locked onto mine, and I was filled with the undeniable certainty that this wasn't some Halloween prank. Jason and Emily screamed behind me, yanking me out of my paralysis. I bolted, the sound of their pounding footsteps echoing in my ears as we tore down the driveway and back into the street. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, there was a moment of panicked silence. Then Jason broke it, still laughing, but it was a hollow sound filled with forced bravado. "Definitely fake, right? It had to be. Just some creepy guy messing with us," but I wasn't so sure. I had seen his face, those eyes. There was something disturbingly real about it. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "That wasn't fake. I think that guy was really hurt. We need to call someone." Emily nodded, still pale, but Jason shook his head. "Dude, it's Halloween. People do crazy stuff all the time. You're freaking out over nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just run from someone who desperately needed our help. The problem was none of us had a phone. This was back before we carried them around everywhere. We had no way to call for help. I don't care what you guys say, I'm getting help, I insisted, turning back toward the neighborhood. With adrenaline still rushing through me, I sprinted to the nearest house and hammered on the door. An older woman opened it, startled by the sight of 3 terrified kids on her porch. "There's a guy. He's hurt." Back at that house, I yelled, breathless, "We need to call 911. The woman looked skeptical at first, probably thinking we were playing a prank, but something in my voice must have convinced her otherwise. She grabbed her phone and made the call, all while grilling us for more details. Once she hung up, she grabbed some kitchen towels and insisted on following us back to the house. I didn't want to go back, but I couldn't leave without making sure the man was still alive. When we got there, the woman stopped in her tracks. The man was still slumped on the porch, his hand outstretched like he had been trying to crawl away. The blood around him glistened darkly under the porch light. "Oh my God," she whispered before turning to us with a frantic wave. "Go home, now." She was clearly terrified, but there was something about the way she said it, like she didn't want us around to see what might happen next. We bolted, not waiting to be told twice, and ran straight home. And that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face. The desperation, the fear. What if we had just left him there to die? I tossed and turned, haunted by the memory, until exhaustion finally claimed me. The next morning, my mom told me what had happened. The man had survived, but just barely. He had slipped in his kitchen while holding a knife and accidentally stabbed himself. Disoriented and bleeding, he had stumbled outside, hoping to find someone who could help him. But by the time we found him, he was on the brink of passing out. If we hadn't stopped, he might not have made it. Later that year, we were given hero awards at the local Thanksgiving fair for helping to save his life. But even though everyone celebrated, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my bones that Halloween night. It was the last time I ever went trick or treating, and the scariest part wasn't the decorations or the fake blood. It was knowing how close we had come to witnessing something far worse. I live alone in a modest little house on a sprawling piece of land just outside a mid-sized Cody town. It's remote, quiet, peaceful and tucked away, surrounded by endless acres of wild countryside and dense forests. Out here, isolation feels different, more intense. Even though owning land in Cody isn't as impossible as it is in many states, that solitude has its price. In spring 2019, I discovered just how steep that price could be. It had been raining for nearly a month straight, day after day of relentless storms that turned the earth into a sticky, muddy mess. The house would shudder under the thunder, windows rattling as lightning sliced through the sky. Living alone, I had grown used to the quiet, but the silence was heavy under the rainy skies, the kind that settles over everything, making every small sound feel amplified. That Sunday evening, as rain drummed steadily on the roof, I settled down in the dimming grey light to binge-watch some shows, content to let the world blur out. Just as dusk started slipping into full darkness, a soft, hesitant knock came at my door. The sound, muffled by the storm, was barely noticeable, but it made my heart skip. Out here, visitors are practically non-existent, especially in weather like this. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease, and opened the door. A man stood on the other side, soaked to the bone, water dripping from his dark hair and pooling at his feet. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a face shadowed by exhaustion or something darker. His clothes were muddy, clinging to his frame, but his backpack looked unusually clean. Something about him seemed off, like he didn't quite belong, standing there in the misty rain with a pleading look in his eyes. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm even as my pulse hammered in my ears. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze never quite meeting mine, and explained that he'd been camping in the nearby woods but had run into trouble with the unending rain. He needed somewhere to stay for the night. His story was plausible. My house was the nearest spot of civilization, a solitary light in miles of emptiness. Still, unease twisted in my stomach. There was something unsettling about him, about his wet, muddy clothes that didn't quite match his clean backpack or the nervous look in his eye. He looked desperate, almost too eager, and when I suggested he use my phone to call for a ride, he shook his head with an odd intensity. "Just need a roof for the night," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. His eyes, when they finally met mine, were cold like steel with a faint glimmer of something I couldn't place. A quiet rage, maybe? I forced a polite smile and firmly but carefully declined, insisting that I couldn't let anyone inside. He stared for a long moment, his eyes searching my face, and for a second I thought he might push past me. But then, with a curt nod, he turned and trailed off, trudging back down the muddy path. I watched as he vanished into the mist at the edge of the woods, the faint glow of my porch lights barely illuminating his retreating figure. Shaking off the encounter, I returned to my TV, but the feeling of dread lingered. The storm grew louder, the rain hammering against the roof in waves. Nearly 2 hours later, a flickering orange glow caught my eye from the window overlooking the backyard. Through the rain, I could just make out the faint shimmer of a campfire at the edge of my property. There, barely visible through the mist, was a figure standing motionless, silhouetted against the dim firelight. My heart pounded as I strained to see. Was it the same man? He was holding something, maybe a walking stick or a weapon. The firelight threw eerie shadows, making it impossible to be certain. I stumbled back from the window, my skin crawling. I was sure he was watching the house, watching me. I grabbed my phone, dialed the police, and explained that there was someone lurking on my property. The dispatcher promised they'd send someone, but I knew it would be a while before anyone arrived. I checked the window again, and this time the figure was gone. The campfire, however, continued to burn, flickering like a silent warning in the rain. Moments later, I heard soft, wet footsteps squelching through the mud. Panic surged as I realized they were getting closer. Frantic, I darted to another window and peeked out, just in time to catch a glimpse of a shadow moving along the side of the house. My heart raced as I saw the glint of metal. He was holding a rifle. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. What did he want? Did he know I was alone, isolated miles from help? I bolted to my hallway closet, yanked out the small handgun I kept for emergencies, and crouched by the wall, trying to control my breathing as I waited, every creak of the house amplifying my fear. Then, a sudden, deafening bang. The man was slamming the butt of his rifle against the door, almost as if testing its strength. The wood groaned under the pressure, and a hairline crack appeared. Adrenaline took over. I fired a shot into the air, the noise ringing sharply through the house. Silence followed, broken only by the rain. After a few agonizing moments, I dared a glance through the peephole. The porch was empty. Hours later, when the police finally arrived, they found no trace of the man. They combed the area and discovered the remnants of the campfire, but that wasn't all they found. Under a nearby tree, partially hidden by wet leaves, was a duffel bag, thick and heavy, well sealed to protect against the rain. Inside were items that made my stomach lurch. A roll of duct tape, a large hunting knife, several zip ties, rope, and a black tarp folded neatly on top. One of the officers muttered that it looked like a burglary or worse kit, planted deliberately, maybe for days or even weeks, ready for use. I stared at the bag, my mind racing with possibilities. Had he been watching me, planning something unspeakable, maybe waiting for just the right moment to strike? The thought turned my blood to ice. After the police left, the silence in the house felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I walked around, checking every door, every window, looking for any sign that he might still be nearby. As I neared the back door, I noticed something chilling. A muddy handprint smeared across the glass as if he'd pressed his palm there, watching, waiting. The sight made me feel sick, and I backed away, every nerve on edge. Over the next few days, I installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of the house. Each night, I lay in bed, the slightest sound setting my heart racing, every flicker of light outside making me jump. Sometimes in the dead of night, I'd catch a glimpse of shadows moving just outside the window, but whenever I checked, nothing was there. I felt hunted, as if he was still out there, biding his time. To this day, I still live in that house, though the memories haunt me. Cody's open spaces offer solitude, but they can feel less like freedom and more like isolation. And on stormy nights, when the rain drums on the roof and the mist closes in, I sometimes feel the hairs on the back of my neck prick up, a reminder that the shadow of that night still lingers, waiting, perhaps just out of sight. When I was 20, just a couple of years ago, I used to babysit for a few families around town to make extra money during college. One of my regulars was the Thompson family, and on weekends I sometimes took care of another family's kids, let's call them the Walkers. They were well off, living in this sprawling estate just outside town. The Walkers had two young children, Sophia and Liam, who were 5 and 7. Each weekend I'd spend with them was always pretty comfortable and predictable, and since their parents left for the entire weekend, they had a guest room set up just for me. It was honestly one of the best gigs I'd ever had. It was late October when this happened, and the air was already cold, with a carpet of leaves covering the ground. I arrived at the Walker house that Friday afternoon, and as usual, the parents greeted me warmly before they left for their trip. The weekend started smoothly. Friday night was filled with laughter and games. Sophia was all about her dolls, and Liam showed off his new video games. By 7:30, Sophia was in bed, and Liam followed an hour later, leaving me with the evening to myself. The Walkers' property was stunning. Their large glass-walled pool house sat on the far end of the yard, right by a reflective pond that looked eerie in the moonlight. Inside there was a mini bar, plush sofas, arcade games, and even an intercom that connected it to the main house, a feature I'd only used to check in with the kids now and then. It was a dreamy setup for a babysitter who wanted some peace and quiet once the kids were asleep. Around 10 p.m., I grabbed a snack from the main kitchen and went back to the pool house, putting on a movie to unwind. I liked staying out there. It felt cozy and private, with no chance of waking up the kids. The night was perfectly quiet, until the intercom suddenly beeped. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. I walked over to it and pressed the button to answer, hearing Sophia's voice on the other end, shaky and frightened. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I keep hearing noises." I sighed in relief. "Probably just the house settling, sweetie. I'll come check on you though." I slipped on my shoes, leaving my half-eaten snack and the lights on in the pool house as I walked back across the property. After entering the main house, I headed to Sophia's room. She was under her blankets, wide-eyed. I gently tucked her back in, reassuring her, and she seemed to calm down. After that, I made my way back to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. But as I stood there, I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway, as if someone was walking slowly. My heart pounded and I froze, staring down the hall. After a few seconds of silence, I shrugged it off as the house settling, or maybe the old wood expanding in the cooler air. I locked up and returned to the pool house. Back on the couch, I picked up my snack and continued my movie, glancing at my phone to text a few friends. Just as I was settling back in, the intercom rang out again, louder this time. My heart raced as I walked over to it, expecting to hear Sophia again, but there was silence. "Hello," I said, pressing the button. All I could hear was faint breathing on the other end, steady and low. "Liam?" "Sophia?" I asked, my voice trembling. But there was no response. I felt a chill run down my spine. The silence on the other end of the line seemed to stretch on forever, and an unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I called my friend Sarah for comfort, explaining the noises and the intercom. She laughed it off, saying I was just being paranoid, but even she sounded unsettled. While on the call, I glanced through the window back toward the house and froze. In the glow from the hallway light, I saw the outline of a man moving past one of the windows. His figure was tall, imposing, and he seemed to stop, looking straight toward the pool house where I stood. I gasped, dropping the phone as fear washed over me. The intercom was still on, and I shouted into it, hoping to scare him off. "I'm calling the police. Leave now." My voice shook, but I tried to sound confident. I scrambled to pick up my phone again, dialing 911 as my hands trembled. I could hardly keep it together enough to tell the operator what was happening. The dispatcher tried to calm me down, asking where I was and if I was safe, and I could only stammer out the address, pleading for them to hurry. The operator asked about the kids, and I froze, realizing they were still in the house with a possible intruder. Suddenly, Sophia's voice came over the intercom, shaking as she cried, "He's here. He's in the house." That was all it took. I ran from the pool house, bolting across the yard and into the main house, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't think of anything but getting to those kids. I found Sophia and Liam huddled at the top of the stairs, both terrified. I scooped them up, quietly leading them toward the front door, trying to keep my own fear at bay for their sake. As we made our way out, I caught a glimpse of the intruder again. A disheveled, older man with a look of deranged satisfaction on his face, standing in the shadows of the living room. His eyes were dark, his mouth twisted in a grin that made my blood run cold. I shielded the kids, shushing them and urging them to move faster. We reached the pool house and locked ourselves in, huddling together in the dark as I spoke with the dispatcher. Soon enough, blue and red lights filled the yard and flashlights scanned the property. The police had arrived. We stayed hidden until a soft knock on the door signaled it was safe to come out. A female officer led the kids out, while I spoke to another officer, explaining everything that had happened. I barely kept it together, describing the figure I'd seen, the intercom calls, and the children's cries. My voice wavered, the adrenaline finally draining as I realized we were safe. Or so I thought. The police soon located the intruder hiding behind the garage. They dragged him out in handcuffs, his eyes still darting toward me and the kids, an unsettling smirk on his face. His appearance was almost unearthly. His skin was pale and thin, stretched taut over his cheekbones. His clothes were disheveled, as if he'd been hiding out for days. I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he was led away. Dark, vacant, and filled with something twisted. Sophia and Liam's parents returned that night, horrified to learn what had happened. They stayed with the kids while I gave my statement to the officers. I left soon after, too shaken to stay. The workers apologized profusely, but I knew I couldn't work there anymore, not after what had happened. The thought of those kids alone, and that face watching me from the window, haunted me. I didn't sleep for days after, the memory replaying in my head on an endless loop. The police eventually informed the workers that the man had been living in an abandoned cabin on a nearby property, creeping through yards and occasionally breaking into empty homes. I was haunted by the possibility of what could have happened if we hadn't gotten out in time. To this day, I can't babysit without feeling a twinge of fear, wondering if I'll ever see that twisted, vacant face again. I can only hope that the kids have managed to forget, though deep down, I doubt any of us ever will. Back in November 2018, my wife Emma and I had barely settled into our new place when our peaceful life quickly spiraled into something terrifying. We were scraping by, starting fresh after months of hardship. I'd made a few poor choices that left us with fines, legal fees, and the scars of a rough year. With what little we had, we needed a place cheap and quick, somewhere without deposits or upfront rent. When we found an old boarding house close to our jobs downtown, it felt like a blessing. We didn't realize it would soon feel like a curse. The boarding house was modest, with 4 rooms that shared a kitchen and a single bathroom. The residents were a mixed bunch. On our floor, there was May, a quiet woman in her 30s who lived with her mother. Upstairs, 2 rooms housed Sam, a young guy who'd moved in the same week we did, and a couple who we soon learned were named Ryan and Lisa. They were around our age, friendly enough to exchange a few words on the porch or share a smoke. Despite its odd setup, the place felt manageable at first, even if a bit cramped. Things stayed quiet until November rolled around. That's when things with Ryan and Lisa started to change. Small things at first. Louder than usual arguments or a cigarette bummed one too many times. Then one day I came home to find Lisa coming in with 3 unfamiliar guys, each carrying cases of beer. That night they partied until dawn, keeping us awake with laughter, shouting, and clinking bottles. We brushed it off as a one-time thing. But as days passed, it became clear that the drama surrounding Ryan and Lisa was just beginning. One Sunday morning, Emma and I were woken by a furious argument. Ryan was screaming at Lisa, throwing her belongings into the front yard, calling her names I won't repeat. She stormed off, only to return a few days later. Their shouting matches became routine, loud enough to shake the walls, each one more intense than the last. The nights were filled with their violent exchanges, but as unsettling as it was, we figured they'd eventually settle things. One Tuesday evening, the day before my birthday, Emma and I decided to unwind after work. We smoked a little and put on a movie. Throughout the film, we could hear Ryan and Lisa stomping and shouting in the room directly above ours. We'd gotten used to tuning it out, but that night, their fighting was relentless. Finally, as the credits rolled, their yelling stopped. Relieved, we turned off the lights and snuggled into bed, grateful for the peace. Hours later, I woke to Emma shaking me, her eyes wide and fixed on something beside me. Disoriented, I thought she'd seen a spider or something small. But when I turned, I froze. There, beside my bed, was a man hunched over my nightstand, rifling through the drawer. He held an empty milk jug in one hand, his face partly hidden by the shadows. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then, as he straightened, I recognized him. It was Ryan. Heart pounding, I sat up, trying to keep my voice calm. "What are you doing, Ryan?" I asked, barely keeping the panic from showing. "Why are you in here?" Ryan stood still, his eyes darting nervously between me and Emma. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low and erratic. "Can I borrow your car? I need to go to the gas station. Just real quick." Emma, thankfully more alert than I was, didn't hesitate. "Are you serious? You broke into our room at 4 a.m. to ask for a car? No, get out," she snapped. Ryan stood there for a moment and then suddenly bolted out the door, running down the street towards the gas station. Shaken, we sat in silence, processing what had just happened. Before we could even speak, Sam, our neighbor from upstairs, came down the hall. He'd heard the commotion and wanted to warn us that Ryan and Lisa's fight had been the worst yet. He hadn't heard any noise from their room for nearly an hour. Feeling uneasy, Emma suggested we check on Lisa. Together with Sam, we climbed the stairs and approached Ryan and Lisa's door, which was shut but not locked. After knocking and getting no response, we slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room was chaos. The walls and ceiling bore strange, erratic gashes, as if someone had tried to break through them. And there, on the couch against the far wall, lay Lisa, motionless. Blood stained the cushions, thin streaks ran down the walls, and her face was a mess of bruises and cuts. For a moment, I thought she was just unconscious. But as I drew closer, the horrifying truth dawned on me. I staggered back, realizing that her face had been beaten beyond recognition. Sam's trembling voice broke the silence as he called 911, describing what we'd found. She's been hit in the face. Badly, I think. With a sledgehammer. Within minutes, the police arrived, cordoning off the house. They informed us that Ryan had been caught wandering aimlessly down the street. In their investigation, they discovered a stash of tools, including the bloodied sledgehammer. The police also suspected that Ryan had been tampering with the house's gas line, potentially planning to burn the place down. The whole experience left us rattled. The following morning, we stayed home from work, watching as reporters gathered outside, pressing for statements. Eventually, the story made the local news, but only as a short segment. As quickly as it had erupted, the media moved on, and soon the memory of that night began to fade from public interest. But for us, it never did. A couple of years later, just when we thought the ordeal was behind us, I received a subpoena to testify in court. I'd found myself in a bit of legal trouble again, this time for a probation violation. While I was locked up in the county jail, I learned that Ryan's trial was finally about to begin. Given the circumstances, the prosecutor arranged for me to testify in plain clothes to avoid alerting the jury to my current situation. The jail had an odd procedure. They gathered all inmates with court appearances that day in a large holding cell before escorting them upstairs. I begged the guards not to put me in the same cell as Ryan, but they assured me it wouldn't be an issue. When they called my name, I made my way to the entrance only to feel a hand tap my shoulder. Turning, I found myself face to face with Ryan. He gave me a chilling smile, leaning in slightly. "Good luck in there," he murmured. Swallowing hard, I managed a shaky reply. "You too," I muttered, running as fast as I could. From then on, the jail took extra precautions to keep us apart. But that single moment was enough to haunt me for years. I can't shake the memory of Ryan standing over my nightstand that night, milk jug in hand, rummaging through our things like it was the most normal thing in the world. It terrifies me to think of how close we were to becoming his next targets.